Hi again. I want to make a longer video about this, but here's a few notes towards a kind of analytic trajectory of both my life and also the reverberations with the lives of other trans people, particularly those that have been affected by forms of violence. And I don't mean here necessarily just within social contexts of transition, but also in the whole lingerie of the journey to emerge as trans, particularly trans women. And what I mean by that, I mean the punishing metrics and measures enacted against our bodies, which do not want to appear at all. And this happens in all sorts of guises. It happens within the patriarchal family. It happens within the education system. It happens increasingly within public discourses, which try to deny trans health and transition care to youth that expressly require it. So there are a number of points in which we can make these sorts of ruminations, but I want to bring it back to my own story, which does have parallels, for example, to the stories of people who are, for instance, seek asylum. I'm thinking, because of my expertise in this subject, having been an expert witness, writing depositions for stay of removal, granting of asylum, freedom from torture through the Ninth Circuit of the United States for different legal firms, and I've done like 15 of them over a space of about the same amount of time, maybe 10, 15 years. The majority of those were not deported. I can only imagine how it would be right now under Trump, which is explicitly anti-trans as an administration. But within the testimony of many of these trans women, there are these stories from a very early age of CSA at that sort of pivotal point of emergence, where, for example, their so-called gender atypicality begins to attract attention of different male members of family, whether that be a father, a tío, an uncle, or, other members of the family. So pretty much the initiation of this form of sexual violence starts very early on and is connected to what we understand as corrective violence, right? In the family environment or extended family environment. Now, the eruption of trans women into spaces of flight at that age, and sometimes by recourse to sex work, because that's the only space in which they can become but also survive, right? You find other actors starting to array that represent patriarchal authority and punitive state, the police in particular, with their attempts to abuse and extract earnings from very young sex workers. The resultant educación truncada, interrupted education. A lot of young trans women in Mexico, especially in smaller towns, but not only, can't stay at school, right? Because violence occurs there. And so they're expulsed from the family environment. Sorry, I'm thinking between Spanish and English. Either deliberately because the family will not tolerate their emergent trans identity, or because of sexual violence. And they can also not continue with school. And so some of them do not even develop literacies, written literacy and reading literacy, for example. So it's a unique socioeconomic marginalization that they find themselves within. And I'm talking about people from the ages of 14, 15, right? This is not necessarily the same reality here in Australia, but the stories of abuse in the family, of abuse by male authorities, especially as a result of their ejection into the street and involvement in sex work by police and by laws that impact on them, is something that resonates across life stories. So from the cuna, from the sort of home nest, to where the violence first initiates, a corrective form of violence, corrective rape, if you want to call it that, by male relatives, into when they first start, exhibiting gender atypicality, to the ejection into the street, which is a context of great vulnerability and risk, to their being subject to the long arm of the state, criminalized, and then having to flee also those contexts of violence, because the life expectancy of trans women, travestis, vestidas, transgénero, within Mexico is pretty much no more than 30. So surviving that takes an act of immense resilience and strategies. That's why many of them have sought asylum. They've sought to transform their lives and to be able to continue their becoming and their survivance as trans women. Having looked at that, looking also very minutely at the testimony of these women, my story is not exactly the same, but the story of flight from family, right? And also the interruption of transition because of the social risk, especially in the 1990s, not wanting to undergo further violence, sexual or otherwise, right? My involvement also in sex work. It's not so different. It's a different geopolitical locale and cultural context, to be sure, socioeconomic context, but I was ejected from the family environment due to my queerness, and here I mean largely, under the gaze of my parents, but also because I disclosed as a young person what had been done to me at the hands of my father. So this is a male relative, right, who had constantly problematized, criticized, attacked me for my effeminacy, to put it that way, and also used it as a door in, under the veil of correction, to actually use forms of sexual violence against me. This is very hard to hear. There are people, of course, that will try to close down these sorts of conversations, and even within, I guess, some manifestations of trans activism, it's kind of like a big dark thing, that we can't talk about our experiences this way because they don't fit within a narrative of a sort of trajectory of becoming that is normative. We are then having to freight with the idea that somehow our trans identities are connected to the abuse that we experienced, which they are not, and I can come back to that. But also, there can be people in our vicinity that even when we disclose, either don't respond, which means that we don't have that support, and we're increasingly likely to have to flee from the context that we're in, where disclosure is also risk, right? And also later on is alleged that it never happened at all. So this is because of other people's discomfort around it and the desire to keep it always a secret, always a secret. I think it's a very good question, because where is the legal recourse? I mean, women in general, when they fall victim to sexual violence, are often not believed, right? In patriarchal society and within the law courts, which are an expression of that. And this idea of evidence presses down on us. Even if we have very good recall, even if we have evidence, trans and cis women are equally vilified and find little room for legal recourse, and also experience trauma as a result of this violence. When it starts early, the chances are it's going to generate into some kind of complex trauma. So you should always listen to the person who has experienced this and survived, because people like me, not just from societal prescriptions, but also because of the heavy weight of trauma and exclusion. And yes, I was homeless. So these are parts of my story that even people who are within my kind of circle or concentric circles of my life don't necessarily know all this content. And instead, maybe we'll make some kinds of assumptions that I've had a kind of sweet old time of things. The story of violence and survivance of the same is a long story. It starts in childhood. Justice must be accorded for when you speak about it, being drowned out and told things such as, oh, you said it didn't happen, right? Just patently a falsehood, particularly in a context where someone has tried to re-establish contact with the abuser, to try to ameliorate, their own fear of that individual, to have some kind of reconciliation, because we all desire that. It's such an unspeakable truth and so hard for us to deal with that we desperately look for ways to heal. But it's never healed until justice is included. This is what's called healing justice of our institutions, our social arrangements, prioritizing the voice of the people who have been victimized, not re-victimizing them. Yeah, understanding this as a longue durée of the different kinds of gendered violence that occur within our society, believing victims, listening, not talking over them, not placing in doubt their claims, which of course occurs in law courts as well, that it would come from someone that is within your vicinity and that you trusted, results in what we know as secondary harm or re-victimization, which only makes more difficult the process of healing. Listening to victims' voices, seeing them as reliable narrators of their own experiences which happened on the body, especially for those of us who have experienced sexual violence, is so crucial. It's epistemic, it's cognitive respect, and that is necessary for justice. So there's much more to trans lives, not pathologizing this connection between sexual violence and then our becomings, but the ways in which we get silenced, erased, our bodies are taken from us, used, for example, objectified, which is part of that gender dynamic as well. And so pathologizing us is just falling back into the dominant patriarchal way of heteropatriarchal way of thinking, of normal life, that we somehow stand outside of that, and that we don't have a right to have a voice, to reclaim our bodies, and to also have justice like anyone else who's experienced violence would at least have a mechanism to pursue that. So I speak very passionately about these things because I have lived through multiple points of risk, flight, not in terms of asylum like the people that I mentioned before, but where I've had to get away from dangerous environments. This is not a small matter. But to then have individuals that you once trusted, who have supported you in your testimony, allege that you reverse that, and that therefore you're an unreliable narrator and you should not be supported, that's almost as bad as the first form of abuse and victimization. I'm a strong person, so I can survive this. But anyone involved in that, with anyone's life, right? Because it's unfortunately way too common that this is how victims, survivors get treated in families, in social work contexts, in courtrooms, and so on. We need this context to understand this issue and to overcome these forms of re-victimization, so true justice and restitution can be assured. I'm not a stupid person. There's a lot of ways in which I've had to wrestle with this issue, and also nightmares that I've had over and over. But I do speak from the authority of lived experience, and no one can take that away from me. I also have witnesses, people who can testify for me, including from those earlier years. I have a statement. And so this is not on shaky ground, but the path now is to actually integrate it for all those taboo topics, things we're not supposed to mention, including within trans community terms, in what Cameron Awkward Rich terms the terrible we, the things, the darker things that we're supposed to cast out to present this face of being a normative subject that will gain social respect. Those aren't exactly his words, but he does cite, he's a trans scholar, he does cite the taboos around the great incidence, unfortunately, of CSA amongst those of us who are trans in particular, something like 52%. So we need to be able to understand those experiences, and also on that basis, not seek legitimacy, but to seek justice. Because what is trans justice if it doesn't involve that? And from a personal perspective, I have gone through so much financial precarity, yeah, over the years, that I only began to stabilize with a full-time job. But that only happened late into my 30s. So there are many valid reasons why one would go through a process of both recognition of injustice and crime and restitution. Thanks for listening.